Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. This is a great turnout. This panel is called The Masters That Influenced the Masters in Crime and Mystery. And we've got a tremendous panel of masters to speak with. I'm your moderator. Oh boy, okay. Okay, I'm your moderator, Mark Coggins. I'm the author of the August Reardon series, and No Hard Feelings is my latest. I'm going to introduce the panelists as we go, but let's get the ball rolling with Karin. Karin Slaughter. Karin Slaughter is
me?
I decided to pick on you, Karin. Karin Slaughter is the #1 internationally best-selling author of more than a dozen novels, including the Will Trent and Grant County series, and the Edgar-nominated New York Times bestseller Coptown. Her latest book, Pretty Girls, is her first psychological thriller. So, Karin, what I wanted to ask you is, what kind of reader were you when you were growing up, or at least before you started writing? Which books and authors stick with you most?
Well, first I would like to complain because I assumed this would go alphabetically, which I hated when I was a kid, but now I appreciate because I can listen to other people. So what did I read? Well, you know, all the classics like Flowers in the Attic and Lace. When I was in Dubai for the Emirates Literary Festival, I kept expecting Phoebe Cates to say, "Which one of you bitches is my mother?" Actually, it happened twice. But, you know, Encyclopedia Brown, Nancy Drew, and then I got into the hardcore stuff, The Stranger Beside Me, Helter Skelter, which was kind of disturbing. I guess now there would be all kinds of parent-teacher conferences because I was 10. But, you know, my parents they let me read anything I wanted to read, as long as I would ask them questions if I had any questions. And then, like, after that, they said, okay, no more questions.
Now, Karin, isn't it true that you missed one key aspect of Flowers in the Attic that you didn't?
I did. I was in college, and someone mentioned Flowers in the Attic being incestuous, and I was like, oh, really? Oh, God, it was. My sisters and I thought it was the most beautiful love story.
And Megan, you wrote about Flowers in the Attic, didn't
Yes, I was fixed, but I didn't miss that part.
Well, you don't know love, Megan.
It still seemed romantic to me, but you know, I think that in some ways for women of a certain age, that was like the dirty fairy tale of our childhood, because you were allowed to read it because it was, you know, it looked like a book that, you know, young teens and, you know, 9, 10, 11-year-olds were reading, and it was marketed that way, and it had little girls on the cover, and then you open it up, and, I mean, incest is the least of the depravity in that book, I have to say. Well, I reread it a few years ago, and you know, there's all kinds of sadomasochism, and, you know, it's like classic Gothic, but now when I think of the you know, what it stamped on our young DNA, our writer DNA, you know, like however dark you think you can go, you could not beat V.C. Andrews.
Well, great. You guys are following my script exactly so far. I've anticipated the answers that you gave, so we'll see how that goes. Let's go with Lawrence next. Lawrence Block has been writing crime, mystery, and suspense fiction for more than half a century. He has published over 100 books, including the Matthew Scudder, Bernie Rodenbar, Keller, and Evan Tanner series, and no end of short stories. His latest effort, a standalone novel, is The Girl with the Deep Blue Eyes. So, Lawrence, what I wanted to ask you is, which books have had the most impact on you as a writer? And is there a particular book that made you want to write, or more particularly made you realize that you could write?
That's hard to answer because all of this was so very many years ago. I read a great deal as a child, and sometime in my fairly early teens, I started reading grown-up books and read most of the masters of American realism. And somewhere along the way, I realized that this is what I wanted to do. And then there was one book that did play a rather pivotal role I read a collection of Evan Hunter's short stories called The Jungle Kids, which was published to capitalize on the success of The Blackboard Jungle, which was his 1953 bestseller. And I realized reading that book that I liked these stories and that I could imagine myself writing stories similar to them. And I don't know why that was the book that made that connection for me, but I've always felt that it was an important one.
That's great. So in doing my extensive research for this panel, I was discovered that two of our panelists, and I don't know if the panelists themselves know this, both wrote their dissertations on hard-boiled detective fiction. So I'd like to ask each of them to talk a little bit about their dissertations, how they came to write them. Now, I don't want a reading of them. How they came to write them, and describe what influence or impact the authors they wrote about have had on their fiction. So let's start with Bill. Before I give Bill his formal introduction, I have to say that in like 3 or 4 Bouchercons, women have come up to me and said to me, "Do you know you look just like Bill Crider?" So you got that going for you, Bill. So Bill Crider won the Anthony Award for Best First Mystery Novel in 1987 for Too Late to Die. He and his wife Judy won the Best Short Story Anthony in 2002 for Chocolate Mousse, and his story Cranked was nominated for an Edgar. His latest novel is Between the Living and the Dead.
And you want to know about my dissertation?
Tell us about what you wrote about and how it might have
Copies
affected.
are not available in the book room. I wrote the dissertation title was The Private Eye Hero, and it was a study of the novels of Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, and Ross Macdonald. And that was written many years ago. Before it was written in the late 60s, early 70s, when you could get away with that kind of dissertation as sort of, anything goes. And what I did not know at the time was that Robert B. Parker was working on his dissertation on the same topic at the same time. And as my wife often said in later years, and look at him now and look at you. So I try not to bring that up too often. I'm sorry Mark did. But those are the guys I wanted to be. I wanted to be Chandler, Hammett, and Macdonald. And also Mickey Spillane, but any one of those would have done fine. But when I finally got around to actually writing something, it turned out that I couldn't do that. All I could do was me, and so that's it's quite a bit different. But all of those guys were the ones I wanted to be, for sure.
But you did have a Private Eye novel series, right?
Oh, yes. I did have a Private Eye novel series, which is great, but it's not as great as Chandler, Hammett, or McDonald.
Okay, well, obviously the other person who wrote a dissertation in this area is Megan. So let me introduce her and have her answer the same question. Megan Abbott is the Edgar-winning author of 7 novels, including Dare Me, The End of Everything, and The Fever, winner of the International Thriller Writers and the Strand Critic Award for Best Novel, and picked for numerous Best of the Year lists. Her next novel, You Will Know Me, comes out in July 2016.
Yes, my dissertation changed my life, which almost no one can say. I had grown up on film noir, but I had read a lot of mysteries, but I hadn't discovered hard-boiled novels until I started my dissertation, which I basically wrote as an excuse because I read Chandler's The Big Sleep and James M. Cain, Postman Always Rings Twice, back to back, 2 days in a row. And I thought, I want to write my dissertation on these guys. And so then for 2 years, all I read was Chandler, Cain, Chester Himes, Dashiell Hammett, Mickey Spillane. And my first novel came out of reading these guys constantly. I just wanted to drop into that world. Particularly Chandler was like the first big love. And Philip Philip Marlowe remains, I dream about him. I mean, it's embarrassing, really embarrassing, which is why I'm telling this large room of people. But there weren't any women like me in those books. So the way to fulfill my fantasy was then to write a book where there was a woman like me in them. And so that's how my first novel came out of that. But it really it changed a lot for me, and it was I didn't have any trouble making the case for it. But for a different reason. In academia at that time, it was very avant-garde to write about crime fiction, about genre fiction in general. So it was everyone was so, ooh, you don't want to write about Faulkner, you want to write about Raymond Chandler. It was considered kind of cool and interesting. So I was able to make the case, and that's changed my life.
My director told me Faulkner was kind of rackety.
Well, and he can do some pretty noir stuff himself. And Sanctuary, you could make the case, is one of the great crime novels. So there's some there. That was the case I made actually during my defense.
Okay, so keeping in mind that Dashiell Hammett's granddaughter and his best biographer in the room, would you all like to comment about the place of Hammett and Chandler in crime fiction anymore? Any more comments about Hammett and Chandler and their influence on your writing or in general?
You're looking at me. Is there well, I've written about both of them at one time or another. I have a book out of collected essays in the field called The Crime of Our Lives, and it's to talk about Hammett and Chandler because they've achieved such status. I was on a panel. It wasn't exactly a panel. It was a joint signing that I did with Reed Farrell Coleman and Nathan Ward just a couple of weeks ago. And Nathan Ward had written a biography of Dashiell Hammett's years as a Pinkerton and how that all influenced his writing in his early career. It's called The Lost Detective because he wrote this book because he couldn't find any information on those years, and he thought, well, I'll go dig for it. And it's fascinating. And I think it's almost important in assessing Chandler and Hammett now and their influence on the genre and on most of the people writing in it has been enormous, unquestionably. But the thing that's tricky now is to remember that they were, guys with typewriters. Basically, they were just people, and the person can get lost in that. It's useful, I think, to know that the reason Hammett's Maltese Falcon reads like a prose screenplay with nothing in it that isn't seen or heard is because he wrote it that way intentionally so it would be easier to adapt to film. I think that's extremely useful to know that. And similarly, there are facts about Chandler that put the books into perspective and help one realize that the body of work of neither of those writers is holy writ. They were not taking down celestial dictation, And it's easy to lose that whenever anything gets venerated to a certain extent. But yes, they're enormously influential, certainly.
Let's go back to Karin. Karin, I've read that in addition to fiction, you've been influenced by true crime writing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I loved reading Anne Rule. And the thing that I love most about her stuff is that she talked not about the bad person and glorifying the bad person, but she talked about crime in the context of the community and the victims and the families and what crime leaves behind. And to me, that's really our directive, is not to just talk about crime on the surface, but to go deeper into what's actually occurring. And if you think about the great books in the American canon, whether it's The Great Gatsby or something like Gone with the Wind, that has an extremely violent, bloody passage where Scarlett shoots the Yankee and she has to fight the impulse to dance in his still warm blood. I mean, there's just so much going on with that. And, you know, I feel kind of honored to be in this genre, and I feel a responsibility that we have to tell these stories, because one thing that whenever I approach a plot in a book, that I'm always aware of, that these things happen every day to everyday people. In the case of sexual assault, it happens every minute practically. And I want to be able to honor that and show it for what it is, and not glorify it and not complicate it with any politics or anything like that, but just show crime for what it is and what it does to people. But, you know, since you're talking about influences, I'd like to mention Meta Fuller Victor, who is the author of the first American crime novel. Poe wrote the first short story, but she wrote the first detective novel. And she was extremely prolific. She was so successful that she actually ended up buying the publisher. She wrote dime novels. I think she wrote over 80 of them. She was a Mormon woman. She had 11 children. She was absolutely amazing, but she's kind of been lost to history, I guess, because mostly because she's a woman. But you know, that was a big influence for me. When I read that, someone at my local library when I was a kid put that in my hand. It's called The Dead Letter. And I thought, wow, you know, it's okay for women to write about this, not just for us to read about it.
And Megan, you have kind of an interest in true crime as well, right?
Oh yeah, I had the Helter Skelter experience too as a kid, and Anne Rule was huge for me. I mean, I read everything she wrote for years, and I'm sort of aware of the two parts of myself that responded originally to true crime, and there's part of it that they are exciting. They're exciting and they're scary and they're very compelling, and some of them even have a kind of glamour to them. But the larger part of it, and I think the reason so many of us respond to it, particularly so many women, is that they really speak to our lives in ways we don't always want to acknowledge. They're a lot about social conditions. They're a lot about the state of marriage, about domestic violence, about surviving, about socioeconomics, often about race, and they get a lot of a bad rap as being sort of cheap and sensationalistic. But actually you see a lot of more of what's really going on in America reading good true crime than reading history or reading, you know, the front page of the New York Times. And so I think that there's something really real and grounded in them, and I think that women in particular respond to them for that reason, because it takes their problems quite seriously. And that I've always sort of believed in. I think that the parts of, you know, I think a lot of crime novelists, you know, are very influenced by them because they want to do a similar thing in their crime novels. And I think that those, you know, I think that in some ways there's been the argument made that the crime novel has replaced the social novel, in fact is the social novel now, and I really think that that case could be made.
Well, that's great. So, Bill, I'm going to pick on you again. Sell us on your favorite overlooked or underappreciated writer. And perhaps it's a gold medal author, I'm guessing?
Well, my favorite of all is a guy named Harry Whittington, who also wrote as Whit Harrison and Hallam Whitney. And he did write for Gold Medal. He wrote for just about every publisher there was in the 1950s. And he wrote crime novels mostly, but he also wrote what I like to call backwoods novels in the vein of Tobacco Road. And Harry had a great career for a good long time, but then something happened. He wrote the second book in the Man from U.N.C.L.E. series. You should all go read that one. And he did it as work for hire, and the book sold like 80 bazillion copies, and he was a little disappointed that he got $1,000 and the publisher made $80 bazillion, I think. He quit writing. He went back to work, wrote a couple of nurse novels as Catherine Harriet Myers in the interim, and then came back to gold medal as Ashley Carter and wrote plantation novels, big, thick plantation novels. He said that he had gone back made it back from Plymouths to Cadillacs after those came out. So, and he's probably 3 people in here have ever heard of Harry Whittington under his many names, but a wonderful, worthwhile, great storyteller.
Well, that's great. Lawrence, you once worked at a literary agency reviewing the slush pile, I understand. Can you talk about that and tell us what effect, if any, it might have had on your writing?
Sure. How wonderful that it also is something that I go into in detail in The Crime of Our Lives. That was at the Scott Meredith Agency. I was, I think, maybe 18 or 19 when I got the job there as an editor, and my work consisted of reading manuscripts sent in by clients who paid a fee, a reading fee, and writing lengthy reports to them explaining why this story is irretrievably flawed. But you're really a promising writer, and we hope you'll send in your next story with the appropriate fee. And I learned a lot about writing. I also learned a fair amount about commerce and human nature, which I've been trying to overcome ever since. But it seems to me that the best learning experience for someone who wants to write is not to read the works of masters, but to read inferior amateur work. It's because you see what's wrong and you see what doesn't work. And that's far more instructive than reading Shakespeare and trying to figure out how he did it, because you won't. You know, but reading a piece of crap, you can, that's the inside term, that's the... You learn a good deal more that way, so it was extremely instructive.
Can I put in a word here? Listen, if you haven't read The Crime of Our Lives, this book he's talking about that he wrote, I'm not plugging my book now, it's great stuff. That stuff about the Scott Meredith Agency, and there are other things in there too. Great book, great book.
Thank you.
Yeah, Larry, I'm a little concerned about how to take your request to read a couple of my books now.
He'll learn a lot.
Yeah, I can be very instructive, I'm sure. Megan, what I'd like to ask you now, are there works from other storytelling media that have influenced you, such as movies or TV?
Yes, I think movies probably influenced me more than anything, even though I've always been a compulsive reader. I was just that kid in front of the TV watching old movies, you know. It's just my whole childhood, that's all I remember, is watching gangster movies on TV, and it really informed my idea of how story works, and I learned so much, you know, from the dialogue, and so much about, you know, romance and how to lead one's life. You know, it just it hasn't been so great in that regard, no. But it's you know, it really the 3-act structure of how movies run, that's how I always thought of story, and visually, you know, film noir is the pictures in those movies are in my head when I write, and I, you know, sometimes it's the sets themselves and the costumes, and, you know, Gloria Graham, who's my favorite film noir actress, she appears in all of my books in one form or another, even the cheerleading one. She would have been a great cheerleader, so, you know, film has been a huge influence. You know, had TV been then what it is now, I'm sure it would have had a big influence as well. Now I do find myself really fascinated by the way we see crime storytelling on television, but movies were just huge for me. They informed my world utterly.
But what about Twin Peaks? I expected you to say something about Twin Peaks.
Oh, yes. Well, that's true. I mean, that came later, but Twin Peaks, I still listen to that soundtrack when I write, almost compulsively. And I still have nightmares about that show, which I'm sure will start up again when it returns next year. In that case, because it was sort of the perfect mix of the melodrama and the crime story, the detective story, which in my books, I'm always trying to push the two together. And even if they don't go naturally, I will make them go together for that reason too. But I think the fact that Twin Peaks is so inspired by film noir, and there's references to the movie Laura in there, and there's Sunset Boulevard and all of that. It's just sort of a hodgepodge of great noir influences.
Great.
When Victor Borge, Megan was talking about just immersing herself in gangster movies, when Victor Borge emigrated from Denmark to New York, he said that he learned English by going to Times Square double feature houses every day and just watching movies and that. And he said it really worked, except for the tendency of he had to drop lines like "drop the gat, Louie" into conversation.
The grapefruit, right? The grapefruit in the face is not a good technique in romance.
Karin, what books might we be surprised to find on your bookshelves?
A lot of galleys that people are waiting for me to blurb. And I get so annoyed because I'll buy them, and then I'll think, oh, wait, I should have checked that shelf first. You're welcome. I like a lot of nonfiction. I just, a few months ago, I finished Missoula, the Krakauer, and it was just amazing and actually horrifying about the college rape crisis. And inadvertently funny because he was talking about the football stadium, and he said it was built to hold 20,000 people. And if you are familiar with the SEC, I think Auburn's stadium holds about 100,000 people, so I thought that was pretty funny. No SEC fans in here, I see. And I like all kinds of books, really. I really enjoy Stephen King. I think in 100 years he's going to be taught if you want to know what life was like 100 years previous, I think you should read a Stephen King. I mean, he's just amazing at character. And I love short stories as well, so I'm often reading short stories. But, I mean, this shouldn't surprise anybody if you're a reader. You don't just read one kind of book generally. Everybody reads all kinds of books.
That's great. So, Bill, who is your favorite fictional hero or heroine? And who is your favorite anti-hero or villain?
Well, you got to see. There you go again. It's either Philip Marlowe, Sam Spade, or Lou Archer. Those are my three literary heroes. I don't really have any favorite villains. Those are the bad guys. Who pays attention to them? Not a lot. But I do have three hero characters that I like a lot. Then, of course, there are about 20 dozen more, but those would be the top three. And I do want to say one thing. I need to tell you the difference between Megan and me. She has Gloria Graham in every book, and a friend of mine, James Reisner, and I say that we always have a part for Gabby Hayes. So...
Put them together.
Oh, no. That's a scary thought. How about the favorite villain to the rest of the panel? Does anyone have a favorite villain they'd like to identify?
I could have an anti-hero. I love Walter Huff from Double Indemnity. Would be one of my favorites. I think. I don't. You couldn't call him a villain, certainly, even though he's a murderer. But I think he speaks to a lot of the impulses in many Americans who'd like to rig the wheel once and see how it goes.
Very true. So, Lawrence, are you a rereader? And what makes a good book to reread?
Yeah, in recent years, I find myself more apt to read something that I've already enjoyed than to read something new. And as to what makes it work, I don't know. Probably author's voice has a tremendous amount to do with it. Do I want to spend time listening to that particular voice? And there are just books that I find almost endlessly rereadable. There are other books that work fine for me the first time, but I know when I finish that I'm not going to want to read that again. And it's hard to know exactly why that works. I know that when I hear from readers that they've read whatever books of mine repeatedly, that's, to my mind, is the dearest praise, you know. And also I'm reaching that age where I can read a book again for the first time.
I'm with you. Megan, you're hosting a literary dinner party. Which 3 writers, living or dead, are invited?
Oh my gosh.
Always invite dead ones. They're
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about allergies or anything.
I'll say Raymond Chandler, obviously. I'll put Shirley Jackson in there. She's one I definitely reread a lot, and I think I'd put Poe in there. I think he would keep things lively, and I cannot picture the 3 of them having a conversation together ever. So I think that maybe Lovecraft instead of Poe, but things could get a little wild.
Does anyone else want to take a bite at that apple?
I took it for the team.
You took it for the team. Okay, Karin. Since you wouldn't answer that one, tell us about your favorite book of this year.
I guess I'll have to go with the obvious. I read Make Me, Lee Child's new one, and it's classic Reacher. And so far, in fiction, that's been my favorite book that I've read this year. But I read a lot of nonfiction this year, so I'm kind of cheating. But it's fantastic. It's just back to the usual Reacher stuff, some nice sex, a lot of violence, and a surprise ending.
Yes, and I just want to mention he stole the backhoe idea from me, because I have a backhoe used almost exactly the same way in my book. So I'm sure I wrote it first.
But you don't have a resentment. You're above such things.
No, certainly not. Anyone else have a favorite book of the year that they want to talk about?
Well, I'll mention one that I just read this past week that I liked a whole lot, and it's a new book called Lie Catchers by Paul Bishop. And he himself, in real life, is a master in and expert in interrogation. And this is about a team of interrogators, and I found it very enjoyable.
Just a couple of weeks ago, I keep plugging this guy at the end of the table. I just finished The Girl with the Deep Blue Eyes by Lawrence Block, which is a riff on Cain in a way, but with a lot more explicit sex in it, and a very different approach to the whole thing. It's a really strong noir novel.
If anyone just came out less than a month ago by Chris Holm, The Killing Kind, which is a great new one. Yeah, all right. Which everybody should read. I think it's going to be a great new series.
Well, this is some great ones. So, Bill, what books are you embarrassed not to have read yet?
I must confess that I've never read Proust.
That's it?
That's the
I wanted a more juicy one. The Mark Coggins.
Hey, I just read one of yours this week to get ready for this,
Okay.
and it was excellent, by the way.
That was not. I wasn't. Anyone else have any books they're embarrassed they haven't read?
I still haven't finished Orlando, and I have a teacher in college waiting for the assignment.
You only have one semester for that incomplete. You know?
Another question that you might ask is, are there any books you wish you hadn't read?
Same answer.
Okay, so Megan, what is your favorite movie based on a book? Why?
I'll say In a Lonely Place, which is one of my favorite books and favorite movies. If any of you know the book by Dorothy B. Hughes, it's in the new Library of America Women Crime Writers Anthology. And the movie is Humphrey Bogart and Gloria Graham. And they are completely different. And they both are wonderful and beautiful and dark and glamorous and strange and depraved in every way. But they bear little relation to each other plot-wise, but thematically they are very connected and fascinating about men and women just after World War II. And I think they're both great. So that would be probably my number one.
Does anyone else want to try that one?
I thought you'd say Bridges of Madison County. I love Winter's Bone. I just thought it was fantastic, and Jennifer Lawrence was amazing in that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and it does hew very closely to the book.
It does,
in a
yeah.
really meaningful way. I mean, it captures it all.
And there's a section in the book that isn't in the movie. I mean, you know what section I mean, but it wouldn't have worked. It was too interior, so they made all the right choices about what would become more filmic.
Anyone else?
You could probably guess mine, The Maltese Falcon and The Big Sleep. I could almost quote those to you verbatim.
Very good. Okay, let's see. Lawrence, whom would you want to write your life story?
Oh, I think I'd just like it to go unwritten.
Okay. I had something I was going to say, but I won't say. Karen, what's the last book that made you laugh?
I love Leanne Moriarty. And what was the last book? Not Big Little Lies. Was that it? Yeah. Yeah. I just think she's fantastic. And there's another author named Claire Chambers who was doing Kate Atkinson before Kate Atkinson was doing it. And she's a British writer, and she's fantastic. And I remember very early in my career, my editor loved her and just tried to publish her. And she said, I don't understand why we're not more successful with this. I feel like we shouldn't even be in publishing if we can't make this novel successful. And they weren't able to pull it off. I don't know why, because later they did Kate Atkinson tremendously. But she was just very hilarious, and she writes about quirky, dysfunctional families. So being from the South, they feel like normal families. And I love her voice and everything, but she's probably selling shoes now, which is very unfortunate.
I just read one which is not a crime novel, but although it does have some stuff in it, called The Family Fang. I can't remember who's the author. Anybody know who wrote The Family Fang? Very funny book. Very funny.
Okay, Bill, back to you. What are your literary guilty pleasures?
The stuff I read, I never feel guilty about any of it. I love to read the old paperbacks of the 1950s. Is that a guilty pleasure? I love the sleazy digests, and I love those books that the titles end in exclamation marks. Call me killer! Exclamation mark. That's my kind of stuff.
There was one of the digest-sized magazines in the 50s. I think it was the ones published by Pontiac Publications, Surefire Detective Stories, and others with titles like that. And every single title, the editor put an exclamation mark after every single one. And I wanted to sell him something called One Dull Night,
Those digest magazines are highly collectible today, not for the literary content, but for the covers.
Yes, true.
Okay, Megan, if you could require the president to read one book, what would it be?
Oh, God, that seems really important question. You mean the current president?
Flowers in the
Pretty
Attic?
well read. No, if you're talking about potential.
We'll just say a hypothetical president. We don't have to.
Well, now I have Daniel Woodrow on the brain, but I would say anything by Daniel Woodrow would be wonderful because there's a part of the country that gets forgotten a lot, and he's writing about that part. And I think that, as are some other writers like Tom Franklin, Ace Atkins, they're writing about an America that is too often ignored and the socioeconomic strata that is too often their voices aren't heard. So I would say that. So Donald Trump better get on it.
Anyone else want to try that one?
Yeah, I guess the girl with the deep blue eyes. He's got a difficult job. He could use some pleasure in his life.
Okay, Karin. What makes a good series heroine one readers will want to engage with novel after novel?
Well, I think it's the same thing for a heroine or a hero. They just have to be interesting. And they have to have some sort of moral compass throughout the series. And no matter what direction it points in, it should always be the same throughout the series. One thing I've found is people don't have miraculous changes late in life. Pretty much how you meet them in high school is what they're going to be. I think that people change incrementally sometimes. But to me, that's something important, especially when I'm writing a series character, is I always want to make sure that even if there is some sort of incremental change, that it's believable as who they are when you initially meet them. They're not suddenly, going from being a serial killer to saving babies. That's what I'm drawn to in books is that kind of, this is someone I know, this is someone I'm familiar with, and they're not going to do something that's out of their morality.
Anyone else want to try that? If you could meet any character from literature, who would it be?
I'm trying to find a properly smart-ass way to answer this.
Anyone get it?
I'm stumped.
Heathcliff.
Heathcliff, that's good. I'll join you.
No.
This is reserved only for Karin. Bill? Philip Marlowe?
I'd love to meet Philip Marlowe or Sam Spade.
All right. Very good. Very good. Well, I think what I'd like to do is maybe give the audience a chance to...
Before you do, I've thought of my favorite villain.
Oh, all right. Let's hear it.
The Misfit. From Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find.
Right.
One of the great villains in all of literature.
That's a good one. So why don't I open it up to the audience, and if you all have questions, raise your hand, and we'll take them. Let me get my glasses on so I can see.
No, I'll repeat it. When I wrote Matthew Scudder, did I have a particular policeman or detective as an inspiration for the character? No, not really. And he grew out of imagination, as my characters generally do. However, I did read Lenny Schechter's book that he wrote about and with Bill Phillips, who was a New York cop, a crooked New York cop who testified for the Knapp Commission, and a whole lot of stuff happened. But it was a book called On the Pad, and that was influential in that for me, in that it gave me the idea of a character who was by no means a white knight as a policeman, but who did function as a good cop anyway, which is what Phillips did. He was a very effective detective, but he took graft.
Did everybody hear that? If you're reading a novel from the Golden Age and you come across a part of it that is politically incorrect, what's your reaction to that? as a modern reader?
Did everybody hear? You already just repeated. That's partially what my dissertation was about, and I think it's really important and instructive, and it tells us about that moment in time. It's usually not about that writer. It's about the world that they were living in, and I think that they are important windows into the past and things that we shouldn't forget. I think the idea I've heard of people wanting to excise them out, or if they teach them, not teaching that. And I think that's the exact opposite. That we need to look at those moments. They're important.
What Megan said a while ago about the books being social novels, I think that's what crime fiction is. A lot of it, even the Golden Age, and that's, as she said, that's the way it was. I don't think we should cut it out. I don't think we should cut out anything from Huckleberry Finn either.
I think that's probably too off topic to deal with here, and also it's hard to answer in less than a half hour.
Anyone else? So the question is, as readers, do you ever find a particular book that you've read has been overwritten, and how do you avoid doing that yourself?
Well, in the second part, I think that what makes someone a good writer is what makes someone an artist. And I'm often reminded about something that was attributed to Picasso, but I doubt that's true because my friend in high school told it to me and she was a liar. But the difference between a painter and an artist is an artist knows when to stop painting. And I think that that's true in a book. Everything doesn't have to be wrapped up. Everything doesn't have to be explained or over-explained. And a lot of that comes with being able to trust the reader to fill in the blanks for themselves. And we are writing mysteries, so I think there should be some mystery. So that's what I try to do.
The only way I can answer that is that one is best advised to write the book one would want to read.
Other questions? Way over here.
So the themes of the big crime novels of the last century were the same, and then they're different. I suppose within subgenres, certainly noir's themes are consistent, and I think remain the same. Fate, the force of fate, desire, getting the best of you. I think that those are kind of eternal, like Adam and Eve. So they won't go away necessarily. And I think the detective as a figure is a kind of figure who's existed throughout time, back to the knights of yore. So I think one of the great things about crime fiction is that these things are stable, but everything else can change and change with it. And we can add new strands in, hopefully, which it seems like that is something that changes, that we're adding new stories to that and disrupting those stable stories at the same time.
Well, I think that's all we have time for. Sorry, we're signing in the Hanover room. Did I get that right? Right after this, so please be sure to come and join us there. Thank you very much.